The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, NAACP President and CEO Derrick Johnson on why the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 is being used today in a lawsuit against Trump. Richard Rothstein of the Economic Policy Institute on the endurance of housing segregation in America and the disastrous consequences. Plus, Bill Press with Mother Jones senior reporter Ari Berman on a new wave of voter suppression across the country driven by the GOP. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. The fight to hold Donald Trump liable for his role in the January 6th insurrection is far from over. Derrick Johnson explains why a law enacted in 1871 to counter white supremacists is central to that effort. And we say hello to Derrick Johnson, President and CEO of the NAACP. Derrick Johnson, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. It's our pleasure to have you with us. And late last year, you filed a lawsuit accusing Trump of violating the 1871 Ku Klux Klan Act. Tell us about the history of this law and why it's relevant now.
So immediately following the Civil War in this country and during the period of Reconstruction, you had many Southern congresspersons seeking to reunify this country, only for them to go back to many of the Southern states that had seceded from the Union to be threatened with violence and intimidated. And so Congress passed an act. And in that act, it ensured protection for those members of their body, that if anyone seek to intimidate, cause harm, they could be held accountable. And the act became commonly known as the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. What's shocking that this act has not had to be used since that period of time. But as a result of the events on January 6th of this year, the horrific attempts to overthrow our government, prevent the peaceful transfer of power, preventing members of Congress from carrying out their duties, this is the law to hold those individuals accountable. And the NAACP, recognizing the moment that we're in now, connecting it to the history that we have been fighting to go beyond, the fact that groups like the KKK and other groups were seeking to prevent members of Congress from carrying out their constitutional duties, we found it necessary under our mission to take this course of action.
What will the role of the NAACP be in moving forward in this lawsuit? And how does this work align with the mission overall of the NAACP?
So first of all, we're serving as counsel, as lawyer for Congressman Benny Thompson and other members of Congress who will be joining in on this lawsuit. So we are legal counsel. Our mission is to fight against discrimination. But more importantly, our mission is to make democracy work for all, equal protection under the law. And what we witnessed on January 6th was an attempt to prevent the peaceful transfer of power because the past administration was seeking to decertify legitimate votes that were cast by citizens in targeted areas who happen to be African Americans.
How did you come to the decision to file this lawsuit? Because January 6th wasn't the beginning. That wasn't the start of this abominable person and the people that follow him?
Well, after the election, there were some 64 lawsuits filed by the prior administration claiming fraud in the election. We had to intervene in about 34 of those lawsuits. Much of what was being claimed was unfounded. There was no evidence. Trump appointed judges, threw cases out one by one. It was found that all of these cases had no merit. But we have seen a pattern that was very clear. They were only filing these cases in jurisdictions that had an overrepresentation of African-American voters. In addition to that, we began to see the strategy of the big lie. It was the same strategy that was used immediately following the Civil War. It's the same strategy that was used in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s that justified this concept that the Confederacy was a noble cause. It was the same strategy to allow white supremacy to spread. The big lie has been used over and over again. And for the NAACP, we've seen this strategy and how this strategy eventually caused harm to many in our community, caused death. And so for us, we thought it was absolutely essential, and especially after we realized in the political proceeding called impeachment, that was not going to be any accountability. And we allow this type of behavior to go unaccounted for, we will guarantee that there will be other incidents. It will only grow from here. We start with Charlottesville, Virginia, and we move towards people being killed because they're Black in Louisville, Kentucky. And then you move towards a massacre at a synagogue in Pittsburgh. And now we end up with an insurrection at our U.S. Capitol. It will only get worse from here if we don't stand up and hold people accountable.
In terms of what you're trying to accomplish, how does this lawsuit differ from what the Senate Democrats were trying to accomplish during Trump's most recent impeachment trial?
The impeachment trial is a political proceeding. It is not a proceeding in a court of law, not a legal proceeding. And unfortunately, we had far too members of the Senate who lacked courage to respond to the evidence in front of them, the videotape, the well-placed narrative of what actually took place without any interpretation. I was in awe with how the House managers laid the case out, not based on their opinion or you didn't have to guess. It was videotape evidence. It showed step by step how what took place was not only well planned, it was a part of a conspiracy that the former president actually ignited, starting with the big lie, creating a level of energy and that people will come, strategically having the protest on the day Congress was convening. Things led to a very conclusive reality, but it was a political decision. What we're pursuing here is very consistent with what Mitch McConnell said on the floor, that Trump was involved and he should be held accountable, and there are court of laws to do it. We are now in a court of law.
We're speaking to Derrick Johnson, president and CEO of the NAACP, and talking about this lawsuit that has been filed against the former president, violating the 1871 Ku Klux Klan Act is the accusation there. And Derrick, there are those who want to see Donald Trump face criminal charges, as you point out. This lawsuit asks for financial damages. What's the potential impact on Trump if you're successful?
So for us, because we are not a governmental agency, the only course of action we could have taken is a civil lawsuit. And our goal is to prevent Trump, Giuliani, and all of those that are named in our lawsuit to be held accountable the only way we had authority to do so financially, so they could not finance and carry out this in the future. You may or may not remember in the mid-'70s, the Southern Poverty Law Center successfully sued one of the largest chapters of the Ku Klux Klan, and they bankrupt that Klan operation. And as a result of that, it halted much of the activities from the Klan. That's really important because if our judicial system, if our criminal justice systems are not willing to move forward, we have to have tools in the toolbox to stop the spread of hate and white supremacy, because not only does it cause harm to individuals and communities, we have witnessed that it can also cause harm to our democracy.
It's been reported that President Biden's Justice Department may also investigate Trump for conspiracy charges related to January 6th. At the same time, some Democrats are concerned that such action may be too divisive. What's your take on that?
This is not a partisan issue. This is about our democracy. This is about our security. This is about our safety. This is about our sanity. There is no way we can survive as a nation if we allow this type of mob violence to continue. There is no way that we can have any claim of a moral center of gravity around the globe and uphold our democracy if people are not held accountable. There is no way that this concept of white supremacy can reconcile with the promise of the Constitution and the democracy. The two things are at odds with one another. All men and women are created equally and endowed with certain inalienable rights. Equal protection of the law should be afforded to all citizens. What white supremacist dogma tell us that only certain people should be entitled? That's inconsistent. We must weed this out as aggressively as possible if we are to survive as a nation.
And to end on a broader note, then President-elect ran on a campaign during which he committed to fight for many of the issues the NAACP fights for. How would you say President Biden is doing so far?
In the month and a half he's been in office, he's done well. He's followed through on much of his commitments. He's staying focused on the issue, not being distracted. We're not being barraged with midnight tweets of nonsense. We have a global leader in the seat as opposed to a child on the playground. We have an opportunity to reposition who we are as Americans and reestablish the confidence of our ability to move into a future that's much brighter than the past we've come out of.
Derrick Johnson, President and CEO of the NAACP, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Derrick, we appreciate your time with us. We wish you great success, not only in this lawsuit, but just in general. And we hope that we can all get to a better place sooner rather than later. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, the history of government-sponsored segregation in housing and how to turn it around. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
When corporate executives are absurdly hypocritical, yet so obtuse that they don't even realize it, is it still hypocrisy, or are they just dim-witted? Consider the histrionics emanating from corporate bunkers over rising public approval for the idea that nature might be given legal rights that are enforceable in courts. The Rights of Nature movement argues that if, say, a mining conglomerate decapitates a mountain, that injured citizen of our natural world ought to have its day in court. Outrageous, shriek the honchos of corporate America. The courts are for people, not for pieces of property. Hello, hypocrisy. After all, a corporation is not a person. It has no brain, no pulse, no soul, no life. It's not even a real piece of property, just an inert document printed by a state. Yet, the owners of that piece of paper claim that it magically bestows personhood on their syndicate, giving it the legal and political rights of real people. Yet these paper people now cry that Earth's actual living creatures can't have any legal rights because they're just property. Excuse me, but a single drop of water has more life in it than all the corporations in the world. Also, let's note that the long evolution of law even had to be enlightened to recognize that such property as slaves were human beings with fundamental rights. The body of legal and moral rights has grown, and it enhances our own humanity to recognize that we and nature are one. Crass corporate exploitation, on the other hand, diminishes all living things, threatening life itself. This is Jim Hightower saying those who mock the idea of legal standing for marshes, grasslands, forest networks, and other wildlife might consider taking a moment by a quiet stream in the woods to ponder the question, does nature need us, or do we need her?
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Racial segregation in housing in America underlies many of our most serious social problems. In turning that around, Richard Rothstein says we have to acknowledge the role of government in making it happen. And we say hello to Richard Rothstein, Distinguished Fellow at the Economic Policy Institute and Senior Fellow Emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He's also the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Richard Rothstein, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you very much.
In 2018, you wrote this very important book, the aforementioned Color of Law. What is it you wanted Americans to understand about segregation?
We have a national myth, really. It's shared by blacks and whites, liberals, Democrats, Northerners, Southerners. We think the reason we're such a segregated society is for something called de facto segregation. We think it was just happened naturally. White homeowners and landlords, bigoted, refused to sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods, or private businesses like banks and real estate agencies and developers discriminated in how they carried out their purely private sector activities. Or maybe we tell ourselves that it's all because people like to live with each other in the same race, and we just choose to live in racially homogenous neighborhoods. Or maybe it's just the result of income differences. All of these individual, bigoted, but not governmental actions is what's created the segregated landscape that we have in this country today. And it's important that we demolish this myth, if it's capable of demolition, because if segregation was created by private activity, then government is powerless to do very much to fix it. But if, in fact, the residential segregation of neighborhoods was created by explicit government, racially conscious rules, ordinances, policies to ensure that blacks and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area of the country, then it's a civil rights violation. And we have an obligation under the Constitution as American citizens to do something about it. So whether the myth is true of de facto segregation or whether it's false, that government created the segregation we know, is essential to how we move forward. And the purpose of this book is to demonstrate that, in fact, the reason we're such a residentially segregated country is not because of private activity. Of course, there's private bigotry that supported this segregation, but the main reason we're segregated is because of government policy that prohibited African Americans from living near one another. And the book goes through policy after policy, federal, state, and local, demonstrating that this is the case.
Let's get into that a little further. Can you give us an idea of some of the more egregious examples of government policy driving segregation?
Sure, I'll give you one and perhaps another if we have time. In the post-World War II period, millions of returning war veterans were coming home, blacks and whites. The federal government decided to move all of the white working class and middle class families out of urban areas into single family homes in all white suburbs. We were not a suburban country before that time. The suburbanization took place as a result of this policy. It was a racially explicit policy. Prior to this time, we weren't a suburban country. Both black and white working class, middle class families were living in urban areas because we were a manufacturing economy, and the jobs had to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals so that the factories could get their parts and ship their final products. Well, the federal government decided that whites were no longer going to live near there. They were beginning to get automobiles. They could drive to work. And so the federal government embarked on this program to suburbanize the country on a whites-only basis. The most famous of these projects is Levittown, east of New York City, 17,000 homes in one place, an incredibly large development. The developer, William Levitt, could never have assembled the capital to build this development on his own from the private sector. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him the money to do such a thing. They didn't think anybody would want to live in suburban areas. The only way that Levitt could get the capital to build this development, and this was duplicated in metropolitan area after metropolitan area all over the country, was to go to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administrations, submit his plans for the development, the materials he was going to use, the architectural design of the homes, and request a federal bank guarantee from these agencies. The agencies gave him that guarantee, provided he make an explicit commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The agencies even required Levitt and many of these other builders to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. And if any of your listeners live in homes that were created in this period, if they look at their deeds, they'll see that that language is still there. It's not enforceable anymore, but they're in homes that are for Caucasians only. Well, this was not the action of rogue bureaucrats in the federal government. This was written policy of the federal government. The Federal Housing Administration distributed a manual to appraisers all over the country whose job it was to evaluate and then recommend applications of developers for federal bank guarantees for their suburban projects. The manual said explicitly you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a developer who was going to sell to African Americans. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't recommend a federal bank guarantee for a developer who's going to build an all-white project if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the manual, and I'm quoting, this is a federal policy manual written, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. Those homes at the time, and this is not just Levittown, but everywhere in the country, were inexpensive, designed for working class families, lower middle class families. They sold for about $100,000 a piece in today's money. Any family whose breadwinner had a job in the post-war boom, black or white, could have afforded a home at that price. Returning war veterans didn't even have to make a down payment. But those families who got those homes for $100,000 apiece, whites only, gained over the next couple of generations wealth from the appreciation and the value of their homes, the equity they gained from owning those homes. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to perhaps take care of temporary emergencies, maybe unemployment. They used it to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. The result is that today we have an enormous wealth gap between blacks and whites, which is entirely attributable to the unconstitutional policy that the federal government followed in the post-World War II period to subsidize white families to move into single-family homes in suburban communities and prohibit African Americans from doing so. The federal government also not only refused to permit African Americans to move to these all-white suburbs, but refused to insure conventional mortgages, FHA mortgages, to African Americans even in black neighborhoods, forcing them to pay much, much higher prices for housing than whites paid for similar housing, forcing them to buy homes from speculators who gave them plans that accumulated no equity. Today, African American incomes on average are about 60% of white incomes. You'd think that African American wealth would also be 60% of white wealth. You can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in reality, African American household wealth is only 5% of white household wealth. And as I say, that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy practiced in the mid-20th century. De facto segregation is an utter myth. And because this was unconstitutionally created, we have an obligation as American citizens to remedy it.
In addition to the equity gap that you just mentioned, are there other even as damaging consequences of the segregation that you write about in terms of the qualities of people's lives?
Sure. We created low-income, segregated neighborhoods with a segregated public housing program. It wasn't just the mortgages in suburban communities. It was segregated public housing. Except public housing didn't exist prior to the Great Depression, prior to the New Deal, the Roosevelt administration. Most people think of public housing as a place where poor people live, but the public housing was created in the New Deal was not for poor people. The first public housing, it was for these same working class families, whites and blacks. But everywhere that the federal government built this housing, it created separate projects for whites and blacks, creating segregation, many cases where it hadn't previously existed, because we had many downtown urban integrated neighborhoods in the mid-early 20th century, many more than we have today. The great African-American poet, novelist, playwright, Langston Hughes, describes in his autobiography how he grew up in a integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. He said he went to high school, an integrated high school. He said his best friend there was Polish. He said he dated a Jewish girl. This was an integrated neighborhood. Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood with one of the first public housing projects in this country, segregated it by building separate projects for whites and blacks. Eventually, the whites moved out of these projects into the suburbs that I described a minute ago. The projects became all black, because they were the only ones who could not access decent housing outside the projects. When we concentrated people who had no access to decent jobs, to transportation to get to those jobs, as the factories moved out to the suburbs and into rural areas, we concentrated African Americans in these public housing projects and in the surrounding neighborhoods. They became poorer and poorer. Eventually, the projects had to be subsidized. At the same time, the neighborhoods got less adequate social services, public services, less garbage collection, less street sweeping, less lighting, less sidewalks, and they became slums as a explicit result of racial federal policy practiced in the mid-20th century.
We're speaking to Richard Rothstein, Distinguished Fellow at the Economic Policy Institute and Senior Fellow Emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Of course, also, as we mentioned, the author of The Color of Law, Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Turning to today, Richard, to what extent are we still living with this legacy, and to what extent does public policy continue to drive segregation?
Well, once you created segregation like this, as we did in the mid-20th century with federal, state, and local policies, you can have seemingly race-neutral policies that reinforce it because they're building on an existing segregated system. So, for example, we have a federal program now that subsidizes developers of low-income housing for low-income families. It doesn't say it's a racial program. It's called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. It provides a tax credit to developers to build units for low-income families. But the low-income housing tax credit today reinforces segregation that we had previously created, because the only place that the developers can build this public housing, primarily, I shouldn't say only place, it's primarily the main place where developers can build this housing is in already low-income segregated neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. Because once we created these suburban communities of all white single-family homes, the suburbs developed zoning ordinances, also on their face race neutral, that prohibited the construction of townhouses or garden apartments or multi-family buildings of any kind. And so the only place primarily that the low-income housing tax credits can be used is in low-income segregated neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. Same thing is true of another program that perhaps your listeners are more familiar with. It's called the Section 8 voucher program. It's not a subsidy to developers. It's a subsidy to families to help them pay rent that is too great for them to be able to afford in areas where rents are higher than working families can afford. The Section 8 voucher program also reinforces segregation today for the same reason. The only place that in most cases that Section 8 vouchers can be used is in already low-income segregated neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. The voucher amounts are calculated on the basis of an area-wide median rent. You can easily see that if you calculate voucher amounts on the subsidy necessary to afford an apartment at the area-wide median, it'll be too low, the subsidy, to afford rent in higher opportunity neighborhoods, actually be too high to afford to need to rent in low-income segregated neighborhoods, and landlords in those neighborhoods exploit the program by charging more than the market would actually require. But that program doesn't say it's racially designed, but it reinforces segregation because of the way the program is structured and builds on top of an already segregated nation. So once we created these racially explicit policies in the mid-20th century, many superficially non-racial policies reinforce it.
This is like a skipping record almost as we go through history. And it's mind-boggling that it's still this way. And it's just like we just call it something different, or we paint it a little different a color, and maybe it's something different in people's minds. And yet it's still the same thing.
Yes, the myth, as I said earlier, of de facto segregation is paralyzing. The Supreme Court has said that if you have segregation that was created purely by private activity, government is prohibited from doing explicit action to redress it. But if we could get the Supreme Court to recognize that this history that I've described, which, by the way, is irrefutable. As you mentioned, the book was published 4 years ago. Not a single fact that I've described to you today has been challenged by any historian. If once we recognize that the segregation is an explicit, unconstitutional creation of government, then we not only have the opportunity to fix it, we have the obligation to do so.
What kinds of policies have to be adopted now that could turn this legacy around?
Well, there are many policies we could follow. They're well known to housing experts and to policy experts. What's missing is the political support to enact them. For example, we should have an affirmative action program in housing to remedy the unconstitutional segregation we created. I gave that example of Levittown. This might be Your listeners may consider this an extreme example, but it's perfectly justified on a constitutional basis once we recognize the reality of how Levittown was created. The federal government should be buying up homes in Levittown, which are today unaffordable to working class families of either race. They no longer sell for $100,000. They sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. That's how the working class white Levittowners became middle class with the equity that they gained. Well, the federal government should be buying up some homes in places like Levittown and all over the country at $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, whatever the market requires, and reselling them at discounted prices to African Americans to redress this very explicit constitutional violation in the way it was created. We passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968. It said that from now on, you can't discriminate in the sale and rental of housing. So a few African Americans can afford to buy homes at $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, and Levittown is now about 1% to 2% African American in a broader neighborhood that's probably about 15% African American. So the difference between that 1% and the 15% is the difference that an affirmative action program in housing to remedy this constitutional violation should address. That would be one extreme example. But I mentioned a few minutes ago the low-income programs that we have. Those could easily be changed, reformed, so that they don't reinforce segregation. We could prohibit communities, suburban communities, from adopting zoning ordinances that don't allow low-income housing to be built. We could redesign the way the Section 8 voucher program is written. We have a few experimental programs in which the voucher amounts are adjusted so that they're higher for families who want to rent in higher opportunity places where there are apartments available, and lower for families who want to rent in low-income segregated neighborhoods. That would be an easy fix to make. As I say, we're doing it experimentally in a few places. It should be done everywhere. So those are just some examples of two real extremes for subsidizing middle-income housing for African Americans who could afford it with discounts and with some subsidies, and modifying the programs for low-income families so we don't use them to reinforce segregation.
Now, the political landscape, of course, is certainly different today than it was 3-4 years ago when you wrote the book and Trump was president. As you look at this new landscape, do you have a sense there is political appetite for making the kinds of changes you say need to happen?
There certainly is. We had last summer and spring 20 million Americans demonstrating in demonstrations called Black Lives Matter demonstrations. We're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about race than we ever have had before in American history, about the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow. Out of that awareness, I think it's conceivable that a new civil rights movement can emerge that will address this biggest segregation of all. It's much more significant than the segregation of lunch counters and buses and the things we addressed in the mid-20th century, the segregation of neighborhoods. I'm actually working with a group of national civil rights and fair housing leaders to create something that they call a new movement to redress racial segregation. And its goal will be to create local civil rights groups that will take action in their communities to begin the process of raising awareness and taking action to redress segregation. It doesn't all have to be done at the federal level. There are many things that can be done at local levels. For example, there are some communities that themselves prohibit discrimination against Section 8 voucher holders. That should be done everywhere, and it can be accomplished by local civil rights groups. If any of your listeners are interested in receiving information about this new movement to redress racial segregation, it won't be launched for another couple of months. But if they are, they could send an email to sign up at nmrrs.org. That's for the new movement to redress racial segregation. Sign up, one word. And they'll receive an announcement when it's ready to launch, and perhaps be interested in joining a local committee in their community.
Richard Rothstein, Distinguished Fellow at the Economic Policy Institute, Senior Fellow Emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, joining us today to discuss the color of law, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. Richard, we appreciate your time with us today. We'd love to have you back again soon.
Thank you very much.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press with reporter Ari Berman on why the GOP is working so hard to restrict the right to vote and why democracy is in danger.
So I think all of us would agree that our most sacred right as Americans is our right to vote, but there are many civil rights organizations today that warn that our right to vote might be in danger. Do you think it is? And if so, how?
It's absolutely endangered because we are seeing the most intense effort to roll back voting rights in decades. There have been, in the span of just 2 months in this year, 253 bills to restrict voting rights in 43 states, according to the Brennan Center for Justice, which is magnitudes higher than previously. Of course, Republicans have tried to restrict voting rights in the past. They put in place things like voter ID laws and cutbacks to early voting and closing polling places, things like that in the last decade, but they've dramatically ramped up those efforts. And I think it's a direct response to both losing the 2020 election, but then also the big lie that Trump told, the election was stolen, which has put pressure on a lot of Republicans to try to change the methods of voting that Democrats used most successfully in 2020.
So 43 states means this is happening not just in red states.
It means it's being introduced not just in red states, but I think the efforts are most concentrated in red states or in purple states that Republicans control. I think the most intense efforts to restrict voting rights are in purple states that Republicans control, like in Georgia and Arizona, where they are extremely concerned about demographic change. They're extremely concerned about higher Democratic turnout. They're extremely concerned about Biden winning their states for the first time in a long time for a Democrat to carry those places. And so instead of trying to reach out to more voters, they're trying to change the voting laws of the state to make it more difficult for Democratic constituencies, particularly constituencies of color, to turn out.
And there's no doubt why they're doing this, is there? In fact, I want to, you tweeted about this, and I wanted to play for our listeners a little exchange at the Supreme Court last week when it was considering two measures already passed by Arizona. And Judge Amy Coney Barrett, Justice rather, asked the attorney for the Arizona Republican Party what the purpose of this was or what was behind it. Here's that quick exchange.
I'm interested in knowing why the RNC is in the case.
Because it puts us at a competitive disadvantage relative to Democrats. Politics is a zero-sum game.
That sort of says it all, doesn't it?
It really does. And it was interesting to hear that at the Supreme Court, because usually politics doesn't enter the court. And Republicans were trying to strike down or weaken a key section of the Voting Rights Act in a case that originated in Arizona. And there were two laws in Arizona, a restriction on out-of-precinct voting and a restriction on ballot collection. And Amy Coney Barrett said, why is the RNC in this case? Because usually it would be the state of Arizona that would be defending itself, not the RNC. And the lead lawyer for the RNC, Michael Carvin, who's been a lawyer for a long time for Republican causes, admitted that basically that striking down restrictions on voting puts Republicans at a competitive disadvantage. Of course, the corollary to that is putting in place restrictions on voting puts Republicans at a competitive advantage. And so the fact that he said that at the time when they are introducing all of these restrictions on voting, I just think just goes to show you the fact that this is really about trying to get a competitive advantage in elections by changing the election laws and the voting laws themselves.
Are they particularly directed at trying to get an advantage or to a disadvantage for Democrats in areas where there are a heavy percentage of people of color or particularly Black majority cities?
They have done that. If you look at Georgia, for example, there are proposals. There's a bill passed by the Georgia House that would restrict weekend voting, particularly Sunday voting, when Black churches do souls to the polls, get out the vote drives. And that's something that's clearly targeted at Black voters, both because of the history of doing souls to the polls, but also because the data shows that voters of color are more likely to use weekend voting than white voters. And I think that makes sense because I think voters of color are more likely to work in jobs that they can't work during the week, but they have more time to vote on weekends. And so clearly white voters are the ones who use weekend voting the least, and therefore the GOP is most comfortable getting rid of that. Mail voting is also a fascinating thing because what they're trying to do in Georgia is also to restrict mail voting, to get rid of no excuse absentee voting, and instead say only a very specific segment of the population can vote by mail, including, by the way, voters over 65, which is the most intense GOP demographic. And it's fascinating because Georgia Republicans wrote the laws for mail voting. They are the ones who expanded mail voting there. But the only time that Democrats actually did better than Republicans at mail voting was in 2020. And of course, now that that's happened, they want to dramatically restrict it. In every other previous election, when they won mail voting, they had no problems with it. So it's clear that this is all driven by an attempt to try to make it harder for Democratic constituencies to vote. They're also doing a lot of little things that aren't getting quite as much attention, but they're making it more difficult. For example, counties in Atlanta to be able to expand the number of polling sites, to be able to offer mobile voting. There's even a provision in one of the Georgia bills to prevent people from getting food and water if they're waiting online to vote. So they're basically saying, okay, well, we're going to make you 10 hours to vote. We're going to make you wait 10 hours to vote, but we're not going to let you have a slice of pizza or a bottle of water while you're waiting in the Georgia sun to cast a ballot. I mean, it's pretty ridiculous what's happening.
Right. Isn't this all based on, well, you mentioned first the allegations of voter fraud, right? For massive voter fraud, for which there really is zero evidence, correct?
There's zero evidence of this. And this was litigated and discussed more in 2020 than in any previous election. And 60 plus court decisions found zero evidence of fraud. In Georgia, the entire election was run by Republicans. The governor was Republican, the lieutenant governor was Republican, the legislature was Republican, and the secretary of state, most importantly, was Republican. And they had 3 recounts, and they found no evidence of fraud. The biggest critic of Donald Trump when it came to his lies about voter fraud was the Republican secretary of state of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, who over and over debunked Trump's claims. And so it's fascinating in Georgia because it was Republicans in Georgia who said that Donald Trump was lying, who said that they had a fair election, who said that Joe Biden won the election. But then other Republicans in Georgia are turning around and exploiting and weaponizing the lies that Trump told to make voting more difficult in the state. And I think that's what's so disturbing is that not just that Trump lied for so long, but that those lies are now living on in terms of all the legislation that's being introduced. And they're essentially trying to do in 2022 and 2024 what they were unable to do in 2020. They tried to steal the election through extra legal means in 2020. Now they're trying to steal it through extensively legal means in 2022 and 2024 by changing the voting laws of the state.
And it seems that the other premise here behind this, which I find bizarre, is and Donald Trump has almost said it out loud when he said, boy, if you allow all this extensive absentee ballot voting, no Republican will ever get elected again. I mean, there seems to be a premise that the more people that vote, the worse off it is for the Republican Party.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure I agree with that premise because
I don't
Trump told people not to vote by mail. What if he had just told people to vote by mail? Then there wouldn't have been any problems with mail voting. I mean, and even now with mail voting, so 1.3 million people in Georgia voted by mail in 2020, and Democrats used it at a higher rate than Republicans. But 450,000 Republicans still voted by mail. That's an awful lot of Republicans who voted by mail to then say we're going to take away mail voting. Wouldn't you instead want to say, let's encourage our people to vote by mail and try to get those numbers up to where it was in 2016, for example, when Donald Trump won mail voting in Georgia, where Brian Kemp was elected with mail voting in 2018, where the entire legislature was reelected in 2020 with mail voting. And so it's just bizarre that instead of trying to win new voters and try to encourage more of their voters to turn out, their entire strategy seems to be let's get fewer Democrats to turn out instead.
So in effect, I hear you saying some of their measures that they're proposing could backfire, right?
They could backfire. I mean, I think what they're hoping is that more Democrats are disenfranchised than Republicans. Mm-hmm. But there's no doubt that there's going to be an awful lot of collateral damage. When you take away a voting method that 1.3 million people used, there's going to be a lot of collateral damage. They're talking about cutting weekend voting. Well, 138,000 people use the weekend voting days that they want to get rid of now. That's a lot of people who have to vote on different days. And you're taking fewer people can use mail voting in Georgia if they pass these laws. But then there's also fewer opportunities to vote in person as well. So what's that going to mean? It's going to mean more chaos voting in person and longer lines. And so it's really a recipe for disaster. And I think it's going to make a lot of voters angry, not just Republican voters. I remember back in the 2020 election, Bill, and I'm sure you remember, the 2012 election, Bill, I'm sure you remember this as well. In the 2012 election in Florida, they cut early voting from 14 days to 8 days. Mm-hmm. And they also eliminated Sunday voting. And there were 7-hour lines in Florida to vote. And it disproportionately impacted Black voters. But a lot of white people had to wait a long time to vote as well. And the Florida legislature actually repealed its own law cutting early voting because what they did was so unpopular. And I think Georgia is going to have a similar experience. I think Georgia is heading into Florida territory when it comes to voting if it makes a lot of these changes.
Right. So we've talked about a couple of them. You've talked about a couple of them. Cutting back on the early voting, cutting back or eliminating absentee ballots, or certainly the universal absentee ballot. What are some of the other specific measures or steps that you see being repeated in many states to try to curtail the vote?
One thing is adding new requirements to vote by mail. So, for example, adding new voter ID requirements, things like that could be burdensome for people, either if you don't have an ID, or in some cases, they're making you, even if you have one, submit a photocopy of your ID, which then means you have to access a printer or a copier, which becomes extremely inconvenient for people. They're restricting how people can get, for example, absentee ballot applications. A lot of states and a lot of counties mailed out absentee ballot applications to voters to make it convenient. And they're prohibiting people from being able to do that. They're prohibiting counties from being able to do that. They're restricting the flexibility that counties have to offer more days of early voting or offer more hours of early voting. In Georgia, they're trying to actually undercut the power of the Republican Secretary of State. They're trying to remove him as a voting member from the State Board of Elections, which hears a lot of election cases. They're prohibiting him from entering into legal agreements with groups like the ACLU or Fair Fight, the group run by Stacey Abrams. So if the Secretary of State gets sued for a discriminatory voting change and says, hey, I want to settle this out of court so we can try to get an agreement that works for everybody, they can't do that anymore unless the legislature, which is controlled by Republicans, signs on to this. So it's taking away flexibility from counties and states to be able to run their elections and basically making the Republican-controlled legislatures oversee this entire process. The same legislatures that are gerrymandered in all these states to such an extent that it's very rare that they'll ever lose their power. So they can act almost entirely without accountability. There are measures in Arizona, for example, to try to cut the number of people that automatically receive mail ballots. Same thing in Florida. There's lists in these states where if you vote by mail in the past, you're automatically sent a mail ballot, which makes it really, really convenient to vote by mail. In Florida, where Republicans have voted by mail for a long time, they want to get rid of that list. So every single election, you have to reapply for your mail ballot, which of course is going to lead to many fewer people voting by mail. The craziest proposal of all the proposals I've seen is a bill in Arizona that would give the legislature the power to appoint their own electors whenever they want after the election, which would essentially just completely nullify the presidential election. And that bill got a lot of scrutiny. So they've reintroduced the bill saying that if we pass it, voters will have to approve it as a ballot initiative. Now, why voters would approve a law that completely takes away their own power is mystifying to me. But the fact that this is even being entertained is extremely disturbing. And of course, remember, this is exactly what Trump wanted to do in 2020. He wanted the legislatures to just completely overturn the will of the voters without any justification for doing so. That would actually be legal if such a law was passed in Arizona.
It would be legal. It would not be. I mean, they are in effect overturning the Electoral College, correct?
I'm not saying it would be legal in terms of the eventual constitutionality of it, but
I got it. Yeah.
The law very specifically said in Arizona and other states, you have to follow the winner of the popular vote in your state. That's what the law said. Now, if they passed a law that said the legislature could appoint its own electors, the law would be different. You're right. I don't think it would be constitutional, because what's the purpose of the Electoral College? Which, by the way, I think is stupid and we should get rid of, but I don't think we should get rid of it in this way, to basically say that the voters have been less power than they already have.
Right. I want to talk to you about the Electoral College in just a couple of minutes, but on this point still, Ari, I think the last time you and I talked about this was a couple of years ago. As you pointed out, these efforts to suppress the vote began long before Donald Trump. And at the time, I remember there were some only 20 states that had measures like this. And most of them were being written and circulated by this American Legislative Exchange Council, I think was called, or ALEC, funded by the Koch brothers. Are they the ones who are organizing this, or is anybody organizing this nationwide?
Well, there seems to be a number of people organizing it. I haven't seen model legislation drafted by ALEC in the same way that I've seen in years past. That doesn't mean they haven't done it. It just hasn't come out yet. But there's a number of other organizations that are already doing this. The RNC has created its own kind of election integrity, quote unquote, commission to work with the states to restrict voting. The Republican state committees, the people that oversee the redistricting process, or the gerrymandering of legislative districts, they've also created a committee to work on this stuff. So it's kind of infected the entire Republican Party at this point. And they've gone from Trump basically just lying about elections to trying to figure out the best way to implement those lies from a policy perspective. And it seems like virtually the entire Republican Party is now on board with this effort, and in fact, making it basically priority number one. And if you listen to Trump at CPAC, and I read the transcript instead of listening to it because it was a little too much for me to listen to it. But if you listen to Trump at CPAC, he says this is an urgent priority, one of the most urgent priorities for the Republican Party. And then he called for restricting mail voting, getting rid of early voting, doing all of these things that would make it dramatically harder to vote, including harder for a lot of Republicans to vote.
Bill Press with Mother Jones senior reporter Ari Berman. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Derrick Johnson, Richard Rothstein, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.